Good morning. The first item of business is general questions. And at question number 1, I call Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the work that it is doing to support elected representatives to take parental leave.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank the member for her question. The Scottish Government remains committed to increasing the diversity of councillors in local government and breaking down barriers which currently discourage people from standing or restanding for elected office. I support the introduction of proxy voting for councillors, and the Scottish Government has been working in partnership with COSLA to look at how this could enable elected representatives in local authorities to take parental leave without risking their democratic mandate in local authorities.
Jackie Dunbar.
I thank the Minister for his answer, and I am aware that he's previously suggested the use of Section 43 to enable proxy voting may be an option. However, it has also been suggested it may open a local authority up to legal challenge, either directly or as a means to challenge decisions, where a proxy vote is the difference. So can I ask the Minister whether the Scottish Government could offer any support to help protect local authorities utilising Section 43 to enable proxy voting from the risks associated with such a challenge?
Minister.
Thank you. As I've said, the Scottish Government is supportive of proxy voting for our local councillors, but given the variations in approach to council meetings across Scotland, it is for individual local authorities to satisfy themselves that any pilot is within their existing powers. While I want to be as helpful as I can, only the courts can authoritatively interpret the Scottish Parliament's legislation. However, in the interest of partnership working and in line with our commitment to increasing the diversity of councillors in elected office, I am meeting with Aberdeen City Council and COSLA next week to identify how we might be able to better support the local authority to run a pilot proxy voting scheme.
Thank you. Question number 2, Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it plans to spend the £295 million in Barnett consequential funding arising from the UK Government's 2002 spring budget.
Cabinet Secretary Shona Robison.
Of the consequentials confirmed as part of the UK Government's spring budget, £237 million was derived from health spending. This will be passed on in full to health spending in Scotland. This is £235 million less than the in-year consequentials from health in 2023-24, which unfortunately were not baselined, even though they largely related to pay. These consequentials also include £48 million arising from local authority spending in England, announced in January, which will also be passed on in full to local government as part of a package of additional funding worth up to £62.7 million. I'll provide a further update on the 2024-25 Scottish Budget next month, with formal allocation of any new funding to be included in the 2024-25 autumn budget revision.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary and Deputy First Minister for the response. The SNP Government consistently like to mislead the public about the amount of funding it receives from the UK Government, but the facts speak for themselves. In 2024-25, the Scottish Government will get £43 billion in a block grant and would receive more than £2,000 per person for public services. Yet this advantage has been completely squandered by the SNP Government, who have to raise taxes on hard-working Scots due to their wasteful spending. Therefore, Cabinet Secretary, do you really think spending money on independence papers while cutting NHS funding in real terms is the correct priority for this Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let's return to the matter of facts, shall we? So fact number 1 is that the health spending that we have got in terms of the consequentials leaves us with a shortfall for our health service, given that it is nearly half of what the health consequentials were for last 23-24. Fact number 2 is that the lack of capital funding included in the spring statement means that there is a forecast £1.3 billion real terms cut in our capital funding over 5 years. So that means really that whether it's housing or health infrastructure or transport, I think that any Tory MSP coming here demanding any funding for any infrastructure projects should be looking at the UK Government's decision to cut our capital budget by that £1.3 billion over the next 5 years. I hope that's enough facts for Alexander Stewart.
Keith Brown.
I wonder if the Deputy First Minister would agree with me that it's also a fact of whether it's a Labour or Conservative government, we've got 5 years more at least of austerity. And it's also a fact that the IFS has outlined that the UK government spending plans amount to a real terms cut to net public sector investment of £18 billion between 24-25 and 28-29. And can the the Deputy First Minister outline what assessment has been made of how much this amounts to per person? And can she outline how an SNP government would prioritise investment if it had the fiscal levers of other independent nations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, indeed, it is a shocking fact that the UK government is planning a real-term spending cut, which in 2028-29 would amount to a cut of around £250 for every person in the UK. Of course, in Scotland, we are taking a different approach. We're demonstrating our priorities through a record £6.3 billion investment in social security and over £19.5 billion for health and social care in 2024-25, a real terms uplift of £316 million in the face of UK government austerity. We could, of course, go much further if we had the full range of fiscal powers that other independent European nations have.
Question number 3, Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the Audit Scotland report, Decarbonising Heat in Homes, and the recent report by the Regulatory Review Group regarding the forthcoming Heat and Buildings Bill, what action is taken to further assess and develop the supply chain for decarbonising buildings?
Minister Patrick Harvey.
Both reports highlight the importance of long-term policy certainty for developing the supply chain. Our proposals for a Heat and Buildings Bill will create a clear long-term legislative framework, giving confidence to the supply chain and enabling investment in its growth. This approach was welcomed by stakeholders when I hosted a recent roundtable discussion for members of the industry. Along with our enterprise agencies, we continue to provide support to innovate and accelerate skills and capacity, and this includes the funding, the development and adoption of innovative clean heating solutions, as well as considering new approaches that are needed to develop supply capacity.
Brian Whittle.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? But over the past few months, I have submitted many written questions to the Minister on such topics like how many businesses are operating within the Zero Carbon Heating Centre, how many heat loss surveyors are working in Scotland, and what economic modelling has been undertaken to understand the future demand on the supply chain. Can the Minister tell me how he intends to deliver on this bill, as he said urgently, if by his own admission in answering these questions, the Government is not gathering this basic data? If you're beginning a journey, Minister, it's not enough to know where you're going. Surely you need to know where you're starting from.
Always through the Chair. Minister.
We are indeed very clear where we're starting from. This government is under no illusions that Scotland and the UK would be in a far, far better position not only to decarbonise our heating, but to ensure affordable heating for people if throughout Scotland and the UK decisions had been made decades earlier, as the most progressive European countries did in responding, for example, to the energy crisis of the 1970s. Scotland should have been building highly energy-efficient homes, the ability to decarbonise for decades. Those long-standing mistakes of successive UK governments are the reason we have an incredible challenge now. But what this government is doing is giving the long-term certainty that will enable investment in this industry. A far cry from what the UK government is doing of watering down, diluting and delaying action on heat in buildings. Just this month, indeed, they delayed the clean heat market mechanism for an entire year, sending exactly the wrong signals to industry about the need to scale up, skill up and invest.
Ivan McKee.
Can I ask the Government whether it's continuing its work on its supply chain development programme, which focuses on building Scottish manufacturing capability to supply products needed for the net zero transition, and which learns the lessons from our success in rapidly building Scottish PPE supply chains during the pandemic?
Minister.
Yes, indeed, the supply chain development programme does continue its work to align economy and innovation policy interventions with public sector spend, including both using more strategically important approaches to improve the capacity and capability of Scottish manufacturing supply chains. Prioritising the opportunities in low-carbon heating and housing means that we're working to make sure that procurement opportunities are made visible in the Scottish supply chain, including with manufacturers. And there's also a huge amount of innovation happening in Scotland to develop the products, processes and services that will enable us to meet this challenge domestically, but will also offer export opportunities.
Willie Rennie.
Late last year, I attended the Energy Efficiency Association conference, an important part of that supply chain. They identified extensive delays in the awarding of grants from Home Energy Scotland, and they said that this was having an impact on their capacity and therefore the supply chain. So what improvements is the Minister making to the operation of Home Energy Scotland so we can get those grants out much quicker, so customers don't cancel their orders, and so we can get on to meeting those targets?
Minister.
Thank you. We do have a good track record through Home Energy Scotland of meeting the targets for grants. Some suppliers choose to count the entire customer journey from application rather than the award of grants from the point where an application has been accepted and processed. That is a bit longer than the UK Government's boiler upgrade scheme, for example, which doesn't include the direct individual bespoke advice and support that Home Energy Scotland provides. So we provide more, and that whole customer journey takes a little bit longer. But we have recently improved the Home Energy Scotland application process to further improve the time that it takes and the smoothness of the customer journey.
Mark Ruskell.
The Minister has just mentioned that the UK Government has delayed its clean heat market mechanism, a scheme which uses reserve powers to regulate the industry to increase the installations we desperately need. This delay came after months of briefing and counter-briefing on whether the scheme was to be scrapped altogether. The Minister has just highlighted the need for certainty and clarity in regulation. Does he feel that the UK Government is really providing that?
Minister.
Mark Ruskell is absolutely right to point this out. The Clean Heat Market mechanism was a mechanism brought forward by the UK Government. We supported it. We said it would help not only to achieve their targets, but help us to achieve our targets, with the potential to shape the growing market for clean heating systems. And it uses powers that are reserved to the UK Government that we cannot use here. So the delay, after months of speculation and lobbying by vested interests who wanted to kill that scheme off, the delay is hugely disappointing, and it will discourage existing boiler manufacturers from increasing their investment in their ability to supply clean heating systems. So I would encourage the Prime Minister to drop his culture war on climate that he launched last autumn and give long-term certainty that the industry needs.
Question number 4, James Dornan.
The latest report by the Royal Bank of Scotland and private sector activity, which showed that employment growth in Scotland was faster than any other UK nation or region.
Cabinet Secretary, I'm assuming you've picked up enough of the question.
I did, Presiding Officer, and I have a note of the first question in writing. I welcome this data, which has shown that employment growth is faster in Scotland than in other parts of the UK. The Scottish Government is using all the powers at our disposal to grow a fair and green wellbeing economy. But the fact remains that Scotland is tied to a UK economic model with stagnating productivity and lessening living standards, and is also facing a number of self-imposed challenges, chief among them Brexit and, of course, self-defeating migration policies alongside. We are continuing to pay the price for Westminster mismanagement and indeed for Westminster austerity. Independence, Presiding Officer, is the route to higher living standards, better public services and a stronger, fairer economy.
James Dornan.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that reply, and I'm sure she agrees with me that, while it's great to see the positive reports about Scotland's economy, we would be better as that independent country, part of the EU, rather than this post-Brexit failed state that is the United Kingdom.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I do absolutely agree with that. The UK Government's reckless decision to take Scotland out of the EU single market against Scotland's democratic will is damaging Scottish trade and the economy. Indeed, modelling by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research shows the UK economy is now 2.5% smaller than it would have been in the EU, a gap which could increase to 5.7% by 2035. That is before, Presiding Officer, we even touch on what we have lost socially and how far the UK has fallen in terms of its international standing. Scotland's future should be as an independent country back in the EU so that we can emulate the success of our comparator countries and seize that future prosperity which this government is in no doubt awaits Scotland.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Although the growth in employment in the latest figures is very welcome, the Cabinet Secretary will know that the employment rate in Scotland still lags behind the UK as a whole. Indeed, the latest CBI Fraser of Allender Productivity Index showed Scotland lagging the rest of the UK in 10 out of 13 productivity indicators, including business investment, exports and R&D investment. Instead of moaning about the position in the UK, can the Cabinet Secretary explain why Scotland lags behind other parts of the UK, and what is she going to do to turn the situation around?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, Murdo Fraser comes to lecture me at a time when the UK has recently fallen into a technical recession, and indeed after his party has, for half of my life, all of my adult life, overseen 15 years of austerity, a self-imposed Brexit pursued during a pandemic, tax cuts over public services and ultimately living standards plummeting, so that we now have a UK which analysis in the Financial Times has described as a poor country with pockets of rich people. I will take no lectures from Murdo Fraser or the Tories.
Thank you. Questions number 5 and number 6 have been withdrawn, and at question number 7 I call Kate Forbes.
To ask the Scottish Government how it ensures that the voices of Highland communities are appropriately considered by the Energy Consents Unit when assessing applications from developers.
Minister Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It is vital that everyone has the opportunity to engage in decisions about future developments. We are clear that this engagement must begin as early as possible by developers. At the pre-application stage, it should be effective, collaborative and meaningful in order to truly influence the final application. Once a Section 36 or 37 application has been submitted to the Energy Consents Unit, members of the general public or groups may make direct representations and comment to Scottish ministers. Scottish ministers take these views into account alongside all other application documentation in making their decision.
Kate Forbes.
The Minister may be aware that the Highland Council has objected to SSEN's application for the Skye overhead line reinforcement. What is the Minister's response to the firm belief of campaigners that, as a result, Schedule 8 of the Electricity Act 1989 requires a public local inquiry, and that in view of the overwhelming interest and response on the Isle of Skye, the Energy Consents Unit should send the application for a public local inquiry?
Minister.
The Skye Reinforcement Project is currently the subject of a live application under Section 37 of the Electricity Act 1989, and Ms Forbes will know that in my role as Energy Minister, I am unable to comment on how such applications are being or may be considered, as this could be viewed as prejudicial to the decision-making process.
Thank you. Question number 8, Paul O'Kane.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the implementation of the immediate priorities plan developed with disabled people's organisations.
Minister Emma Roddick.
The Scottish Government is working hard to improve the lives of disabled people. The Independent Living Fund, which supports disabled people, will reopen to new applicants after receiving a £9 million investment as part of the 2024-25 Scottish Budget, and will support around 1,000 new applicants. Later this year, we will implement an immediate priorities plan that will deliver a range of actions to support disabled people. In addition, £5 million from our Equality and Human Rights Fund supports disabled people's organisations to tackle inequality and discrimination, furthering equality and advancing the realisation of human rights in Scotland.
Paul O'Kane.
Disabled people across my West Scotland region have been in touch with me to express their frustration at a government that they feel is not taking the issues and concerns of disabled people seriously. Whilst they have welcomed the intent behind the immediate priorities plan, it has become something of a misnomer because there is no immediacy on something that you have been discussing for a year, and we've seen very little progress. And indeed, the Minister's answer there suggests later this year sometime we'll see further progress. So will she listen to the concerns of disabled people who are raising these issues with their MSPs? And what is she going to do to energise this work as a matter of urgency so that we can deliver on the action for the challenges facing disabled people in Scotland?
Minister.
The member will appreciate that this is a plan that is being co-produced with disabled people's organisations, and on Tuesday this week I met with those disabled people's organisations along with the First Minister and the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that we are moving forward as quickly as we can with publishing and then implementing the plan. I do want to point out that this is not the only piece of work that we are undertaking to support disabled people. Indeed, I covered a few in my initial answer, but I'd be more than happy to share even more of what the Scottish Government is doing with the member if he is interested.
Thank you. That concludes general questions. The next item of business is First Minister's questions, and at question number 1, I call Douglas Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just a few weeks ago, this chamber congratulated Henry Wooga on reaching his 100th birthday. So it was with great sadness that we learned of his passing peacefully at home with his daughters Hilary and Gillian last Friday. We send them our thoughts and condolences, and we also give thanks to the life of this remarkable man. From Nuremberg in 1939 to Glasgow via the Kindertransport, to life of professional and family success here in Scotland, capped by decades of service to Holocaust education. Scotland will miss his charm, his integrity and resolution, but we will never forget his testimony. And I believe that we can all commit to ensuring that his legacy will endure. Now reunited with his beloved Ingrid, may his memory be a blessing. Presiding Officer, can I remind the Chamber that my wife is a serving officer with Police Scotland? The Hate Crime Act comes into effect from the 1st of April. We voted against this law and still oppose it as a serious risk to free speech. But in just 11 days' time, the police will have to enforce it. David Kennedy, the General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, has said this about training. We're only receiving a 2-hour online training package. First Minister, is that really enough for a complex and controversial piece of legislation?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first and foremost, can I join with Douglas Ross in paying tribute to Henry Wooga, a greatly respected Holocaust survivor who we know passed away at the age of 100 earlier this week. It's hard to think that only a few weeks ago we stood up to wish him well on his 100th birthday, and now we're standing up once again to mourn his passing, because Henry was a truly remarkable man who made an enormous contribution to Scottish society, but his impact, his influence, his legacy goes far beyond Scotland, as he campaigned against anti-Semitism and, of course, reminded us to never ever forget the horrors of the Holocaust. My thoughts are very much with Henry's family, his friends and all those who had the privilege of knowing him, and in his memory we will all continue, I'm sure, to campaign against hatred in whichever form it rears its ugly head. Presiding Officer, can I also just take, with your indulgence, a moment to congratulate Vaughan Gething on his appointment as First Minister of Wales. His appointment as the first black leader of a government in the UK is a truly monumental moment, and I look forward to working with him. Vaughan Gething's predecessor, Mark Drakeford, was a principled First Minister, a model public servant, importantly a very fierce defender of devolution. I think the whole Chamber want to join me in wishing him well. Presiding Officer, to the matter at hand, first of all, let me say, when it comes to the hate crime bill, the Hate Crime Act, forgive me, there has been a lot of disinformation that has been spread on social media and some inaccurate media reporting and indeed by our political opponents. So I'm hoping this exchange we can shed more light than heat on what is actually in the Act as opposed to what is being said about it. In terms of training for police, let me say that I leave it as an operational decision and a matter for the Chief Constable to determine what training is absolutely appropriate. And of course, Police Scotland put out a statement just this week to challenge some of, in their words, the inaccurate media reporting that exists around the Hate Crime Act. So I've got absolute confidence in Police Scotland to ensure the appropriate training is in place. And let me just remind Douglas Ross, of course, that stirring up offences are not new in Scotland. You know, as a person of colour, I've been protected from anybody stirring up hatred against me because of my race virtually all of my life, since 1986. In fact, all of us are protected by that provision of stirring up hatred. The question is, if I have protection against somebody stirring up hatred because of my race, and that has been the case since 1986, why on earth should those protections not exist for somebody because of their sexuality or disability or their religion? So the facts are that for an offence, a new stirring up offence, to be committed, we know there is a very high threshold, in fact, an even higher threshold than the barrier that there is, or the threshold that there is for a racial stirring up offence. And I would say to Douglas Ross, it's incredibly important, in the memory of people like Henry Wooga, where he started his contribution, that we all unite in standing up and opposing hatred in all of its forms. And a strong legislative framework to protect people is incredibly important. I would urge the Conservatives, I would urge Douglas Ross, that it would be far better for him, I think, to put more effort into tackling hatred as opposed to opposing a hate crime act.
Douglas Ross.
Can I echo the First Minister's comments and wish Von Gethin well as the new First Minister of Wales? But we opposed the legislation at the time and still oppose it now because of the impact it has on free speech for people across this country. And I'm only reiterating the points made by the Scottish Police Federation, the representative body of our officers across Scotland. They say that their officers can barely deal with existing crimes, let alone this new law. They described the Hate Crime Act as, and I quote, a recipe for disaster. Humza Yousaf has reduced officer numbers to the lowest level since Police Scotland was formed. Now officers are being told not to investigate actual crimes, but instead they'll have to look for the hate monster or police free speech. Criminals will be let off while innocent people are prosecuted. Isn't Humza Yousaf setting the police up for failure and undermining public trust in policing?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, with that contribution, it is Douglas Ross who is undermining the fight against hatred here in Scotland. Absolutely undermining it completely, utterly and entirely through so much disinformation. I don't even know where to begin. So let's take point by point of what Douglas Ross has said. First and foremost, he makes an incorrect claim around police officer numbers under the SNP government. Of course, under the SNP government, numbers of police officers have increased and will continue to increase, given what we have heard recently from the Chief Constable and backed by a record budget from this Scottish Government. And of course, there are more police officers per head in Scotland than in England, where his party is, of course, in charge. Let's take the points that Douglas Ross raises around the Act itself and freedom of expression. I remember, of course, because I was the Justice Secretary that took forward this bill, making sure that I engaged with opposition members around the issue of freedom of expression. There is a triple lock of freedom of expression in the Act. There is protection of freedom of expression that's actually explicitly embedded in the Act. There's also a defence available of a person's behaviour being reasonable, which safeguards people's rights. And thirdly, of course, the Act itself is compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights, including Article 10, which includes and protects everybody's right to freedom. When it comes to stirring up of hatred, Presiding Officer, stirring up offences are so pervasive, so damaging, so dangerous in our society. Let me just take Douglas Ross back to what Lord Bracadale said. Lord Bracadale, of course, was the one who reported on his independent review of hate crime, which then led to the development of legislation. He said, and I'll quote, "The stirring up of hatred can contribute to a social atmosphere in which prejudice and discrimination are accepted as normal. In any society, Presiding Officer, the freedom to criticise, the freedom to insult, the freedom to offend exists and should be treasured, in fact. But there cannot be freedom to engage in behaviour that is threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. So everybody in this chamber, we engage, we talk often about our commitment to tackle hatred. Those who experience hatred tell me they don't just want warm words from their politicians, they want action, and that's exactly what this Hate Crime Act intends to do.
Douglas Ross.
But people want action that is enforceable, and the Scottish Police Federation are saying they have serious concerns. Their officers are receiving a 2-hour online training module for this legislation. And the First Minister keeps trying to say these are my comments. They're not. I originally was quoting the Scottish Police Federation. Let me now quote legal experts like Roddy Dunlop, the Dean of the...
Please continue, Mr Ross.
I think it's only right that we say ministers in the Scottish Government don't think we should be hearing from the Faculty of Advocates.
Please continue, Mr Ross. Let us hear Mr Ross.
Yeah. Well, I can say it was Marie Todd. It was the Minister that said
Mr Ross, can I ask you to continue with your question? Members, can we please ensure that we can hear Mr Ross?
So, legal experts, including Roddy Dunlop, the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates, said there is a danger of the police being swamped by completely malicious complaints. Not my views, but the Dean of the Faculty of Advocates. Days before this law comes into force, it's unclear how those complaints would be dealt with by the police. People like J.K. Rowling could have the police at her door every day for making perfectly reasonable statements. That could lead to huge numbers of the public being monitored or even criminalised by the police when they have done nothing wrong. Isn't Humza Yousaf putting frontline officers in an impossible position by forcing them to police free speech?
First Minister.
No, Presiding Officer, we know it's often police officers, unfortunately, that are the victims of hatred themselves. They are often the ones who are facing hatred when it comes to the course of their duties. Presiding Officer, Douglas Ross says he has no idea how a stirring up offence could possibly be enforceable. I'm making the point that a stirring up offence in relation to racial hatred has existed since 1986, with virtually zero controversy whatsoever. So I have absolute faith in Police Scotland's ability to police and enforce this Act in a way that is appropriate. In terms of the points that Roddy Dunlop, who of course I respect greatly, the points that I would say in respect to Roddy Dunlop is that police, again, are very, very well attuned, adept and have ability to deal with vexatious complaints right across the legal framework with which they operate. So I can't tell you whether there will be vexatious complaints or not. That will, of course, depend on people's actions. But what I can say is that the liability for criminal threshold is incredibly high. If you don't want to take my word for it, let's look at another legal expert. This one, Professor Adam Tompkins, I think known to Douglas Ross, formerly a Conservative MSP, somebody I worked with in relation to the hate crime bill. He writes in today's Herald, and he's of course a Professor of Public Law, and I'll quote from him directly. Offensive speech is not criminalised by this legislation. The only speech relating to sexual orientation, transgender identity, age or disability outlawed here is speech which, 1, a reasonable person would 2, consider to be threatening or abusive, 3, which was intended to stir up hatred, and 4, was not reasonable in any circumstances. He goes on to say, just because you feel offended by what someone does not make it a hate crime. And then goes on to say, under the Hate Crime Act, the threshold of criminal liability is not a victim that feels offended, i.e. a subjective test, but that a reasonable person would consider the perpetrator's actions or speech to be threatening or abusive. So, Presiding Officer, let's stick to the facts. And the facts are this, that we are all purport to be concerned about the rises in hate crime that we've seen in our society over the years. But there's only some parties in this chamber that I believe are willing to take the action that is necessary to tackle it. It was, of course, an act and a bill at that point that was debated thoroughly in this chamber. It is unfortunate that the only party that opposed it, of course, was the Conservatives, Presiding Officer.
Douglas Ross.
In a democracy, we have scrutiny. we have opposition parties to look at the legislation coming forward. And there have been and continue to be serious reservations about this Act that was passed and now how it will be implemented. Let's remember, Humza Yousaf introduced this unworkable and dangerous law when he was Justice Secretary. Now he's bringing it into force as First Minister with little training and not enough support for the officers who will have to enforce it. Let's have a quote from a Professor of Law at Glasgow University, First Minister just quoted. Alistair Bonington said this: "Like many of the SNP's attempts at lawmaking, this Act will be set aside when it is properly examined in a serious court." This looks like another SNP law that will have to be discarded, just like the named persons and the offensive behaviour at Football Act. We've said from the outset this law is a disaster in the making. It criminalises free speech. It risks a fundamental right. It's overreach by the SNP into people's homes. It could result in the public being criminalised for no good reason. It is set to be a shambles.
Let's hear Mr Ross.
It is set to be a shambles from day one in just 11 days' time. So will Humza Yousaf finally accept that he has created another bad SNP law that will quickly descend into chaos?
First Minister.
What's dangerous, Presiding Officer, isn't the law. What's dangerous is hate crime in our society, Presiding Officer. You see, Presiding Officer, we did debate this Act when it was, of course, a bill going through this Parliament extensively. Many years ago, robust debate. Actually, I thought debate is sometimes and often the best traditions of this Parliament. There was compromises. There was amendments that were accepted by the government. We came out of that process with a good piece of legislation that fundamentally protected people's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also safeguarded people's right not to have hatred stirred up against them. And of course, there was only one party that opposed that bill, Douglas Ross and the Conservative Party. And maybe, Presiding Officer, it's hardly a surprise, given that the Conservative Party, far from working hard to tackle hatred, they're a party that have actively created the conditions for hatred and division to thrive in our society. The Conservative Party, Presiding Officer, are the party.
Let's hear the First Minister.
The Conservative Party are the party of go-home vans, the party of the hostile environment, the party of Windrush, the party whose leader, Boris Johnson, called Muslim women
First Minister.
bank robbers. They are a party that indulges in Islamophobic smears from Suella Braverman to Lee Anderson. So instead of fighting against this bill, wouldn't it be better, Presiding Officer, that the Conservatives got their own house in order?
Question number 2, Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I join others in, first of all, paying tribute to Henry Wooga, a Holocaust survivor who very powerfully shared his own story, the stories of others, and always campaigned against anti-Semitism. And we send our best wishes to his friends, family and the wider Jewish community. We owe it to Henry and his entire generation to make sure we share their stories and always strive for both peace and strive for a world free of prejudice and hate. Can I also join the First Minister in congratulating Ron Gething on his election, another historic first, the first ever black leader of a nation in Europe as the First Minister of Wales, and send our best wishes to his predecessor, Mark Drakeford. Presiding Officer, this morning a damning report by the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health has warned of the catastrophic consequences of this government's failure. In paediatrics alone, over 10,000 children are waiting for the medical care they need. 50% of them have been waiting for more than the legal 12 weeks. So how does the First Minister respond to one of the leading paediatric consultants in the country, Dr. Mary Stark, who said, if you miss the right window to treat a child or wait too long, the consequences can be irreversible, and that this is a clear failure to prioritise the health and well-being of our children?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first and foremost, I would take the report from the Royal College extremely seriously indeed, and of course we'll be examining and are examining that report in detail. As ever, of course, it is important for me to provide some context of why we're seeing such high numbers of young people, young children, waiting. The undeniable reason for that significant increase is undoubtedly the global pandemic, hence why we've seen those significant increases in paediatric weights right across the UK and England and in Wales, and of course here in Scotland too. Anna Sarwar is right, of course, and Royal College are right to raise the concerns around this issue. So let me try to give some assurances that we are focusing on tackling these far too long waits in paediatrics, just as by way of some examples. We know that there's two main paediatric specialities, paediatrics and paediatric surgery. If I take the data from April 23 to the end of the calendar year, December 23, the paediatric new outpatient list reduced by 21%, weights over 52 weeks reduced by 12%, and weights over 78 weeks reduced by 31%, and weights over 2 years were completely eradicated. If I take the position over the 2 years, December 21 to December 2023, and look at paediatric surgery, the new outpatient list for paediatric surgery reduced by 35%, weights of over 52% reduced by 84%, over 78 weeks reduced by 95%. The purpose of reiterating these statistics, and we know that, of course, behind each of these statistics is a young child who's waiting too long for surgery, is to show that there are improvements, we are moving in the right direction. What, of course, makes the recovery of the NHS far more difficult is the fact that, of course, we're receiving cuts from the Conservatives on our budget, £500 million over 2 years, £1.3 billion in terms of our capital. We are, of course, investing in our NHS despite those cuts. It would be helpful to know from Anna Sarwar that if there is an incoming Labour government, they would immediately reverse those Conservative cuts, because it impedes our ability in order to invest in the NHS's recovery, which of course is much needed for our children, our young people, as well as our adults too.
Anna Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister knows that this problem predates the pandemic, that the report makes clear 11 years of decline, every day of which there has been an SNP government, and he also knows that Labour is going to invest more in the National Health Service, and we do want to bring down waiting lists, but he has to take responsibility for his government's actions, not look to blame somebody else all the time. The crisis in children's health goes further than even this report warns. Across our NHS, whether in CAMS services or in other specialisms, children face unacceptable waits that have left them distressed and in pain. One mum, Amy, has told me the struggles faced by her 3-year-old son, Cody. Cody has been repeatedly diagnosed with tonsillitis, and his enlarged tonsils obstruct over 75% of his airway, making it difficult to eat, drink and even breathe. She's told me that she has to lie awake next to him during the night because his breathing stops, and she has to nudge him to restart his breathing again. She's had to fight to get Cody referred to a specialist, but has been told that an urgent referral for treatment will take 3 years. Amy has had to make the difficult decision to go private, borrowing almost £5,000 from her family. Why is he and his government failing Amy, Cody and so many families like theirs?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I'm obviously more than happy to look at the case that is referenced by Anna Sarwar in terms of Cody's case, and indeed any other case that a member raises. We're happy to explore with the Health Board in terms of what more can be done. It sounds like a horrifically long wait that we don't want any parent to have to endure. The point I make to Anna Sarwar is, of course, that there is progress being made. I've given him a range of details around how that progress is being made in relation to paediatric surgery, which is relevant to his question, but we're also making sure that we're investing in the workforce. So paediatric specialty consultants, we've increased their numbers by 15% in the last 5 years, by 64% in the last 10 years. When we look at qualified paediatric nurses, the workforce has increased by 11% in the last 5 years, and since 2014 we've also invested in the recruitment of an additional 500 health visitors and 200 extra school nurses, again, which undoubtedly help with young people and children's health and well-being. So I don't take lightly at all the issues that Anna Sarwar raises about the long waits that parents and the children are having to suffer. In Anna Sarwar's initial response, of course, he didn't answer the question that I asked, which was that, of course, would an incoming Labour government, potentially incoming Labour government, immediately reverse the £1.3 billion cut, which is making an impact in terms of our healthcare provision. If he could
Briefly,
give that
First Minister.
then we may be able to plan further ahead in terms of the further investment we're able to make, because it's only through record investment in the NHS are we going to be able to recover our national health services for children and young people.
Honestly, Presiding Officer, after 17 years of this SNP government, wanting to ask questions about a party in opposition rather than talking about their own record and failing children across the country just shows how out of depth this First Minister is. All those lists, all those excuses mean nothing to Amy, mean nothing to Cody, and mean nothing to the thousands of families that his government is failing every single day. Because he simply does not get it. In every area of responsibility for this SNP government, children are being failed with catastrophic consequences. After 17 years of this SNP government, 240,000 children are living in poverty, over 10,000 children waiting for paediatric medical care, over 9,500 children turned away from mental health services last year. I suggest the Deputy First Minister listen to the consequences for her constituents rather than trying to heckle what's happening to children across this country. And for those that were referred, over 5,500 children are waiting to get mental health support. And now nearly a third of pupils in Scotland are persistently absent from school, in some areas as high as 50%. Almost 40% of pupils now need additional support. At the same time, this SNP government has cut 400 ASN posts in the last decade. Isn't it clear that Humza Yousaf and every single member of this SNP government are failing Scotland's children?
First Minister.
No, I don't agree with that, Presiding Officer. I thought it was a pretty reasonable question, which obviously Anna Sarwar is unable to answer, and he'll want to maybe be honest with people about the answer. He was unable to answer a very simple question, that if there is an incoming Labour government, will they immediately reverse the Tory cut to Scotland's budget? The fact that he was unable to answer the question demonstrates that he either does not know the answer, Presiding Officer, or he is not being honest with the people of Scotland. And what I would say to Anna Sarwar is it is fundamentally important in all of the areas of public service that we invest. That's why this government took the decision to make sure we prioritise our public services. That's why we gave an increase to the National Health Service, made sure there was an increase to education services, made there was an increase to social security. All of these issues incredibly important for our children and young people. That is why, of course, the estimates show that 100,000 children in Scotland will be lifted out of poverty because of our actions. That's why, of course, more young people in this country are going to university from areas of higher deprivation because of our investment. That's why more young people, we have record young people going into positive destinations because of our investment in education, early learning and childcare, Presiding Officer.
Briefly, First Minister.
And that is why, of course, is imperative throughout all of these challenges that governments and political parties make a decision. Do they invest in public services?
Thank you, First Minister. We must move on to the next question. First Minister. First Minister. First Minister. I have asked that you conclude your question. I am now moving on to the next question. That you conclude your response. Question number 3, Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I associate the Scottish Liberal Democrats with the remarks already made about the passing of Henry Wooga and indeed the election of Ron Gething, to ask the First Minister when the Cabinet will next meet?
First Minister.
Tuesday.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Presiding Officer, yesterday the Committee on Climate Change delivered a devastating verdict about the record of the Scottish Government. The key 2030 emissions target just won't be met. The Government is off course by a country mile on heat pumps, electric vehicles, recycling and more. And its Chair, Chris Stark, said yesterday the strategy is just not there. Take tree planting. They say Scotland needs to do twice as much, but the Government has just reduced spending on that by nearly half. is going to put people out of work, and tree nurseries have already signalled they will have to torch hundreds of thousands of saplings because of the cuts. To think the Environment Secretary once boasted that global leaders were looking to her government for advice, well, her phone is silent now. So can I ask the First Minister, where are the Green Party in all of this? Fewer bus and train services, going nowhere on renewable heating, a botched deposit return scheme. Doesn't he recognise that bringing them into government has done precious little to help us combat the climate emergency?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first of all, we do take the report from the Climate Change Committee extremely seriously, and Chris Stark, well respected, and therefore, of course, his opinions are being given the due and weighty consideration that they deserve. It's a serious point, of course, that he raises around the 2030 target. Of course, at the time when that target was being debated, the Climate Change Committee made it clear that it would be extremely difficult, if not frankly impossible, or indeed that target was stretching credibility at that time. Nonetheless, we as a Parliament came together, all political parties came together to embed that target within the legislation. In terms of tree planting, let me just remind Alex Hamilton that around 75% of all new woodland throughout the UK is here in Scotland. Not only that, we launched, of course, the world's largest floating offshore wind leasing round through Scotland. We ensured, of course, that Scotland has the most concessionary travel scheme in the UK, with more than a third of the population benefiting from free bus travel. We invested £65 million in installation of over 2,700 public EV chargers, and we continue to offer the most generous package of grants and loans in the UK to support the move to clean heating. What I would say to Alex Hamilton, what makes this job of ours more difficult in trying to reach our targets, and we are committed to that overall 2045 target, of course, what makes that more difficult is every time we bring forward measures, be it the deposit return scheme, low emission zones, workplace parking levy, proposals
briefly,
for carbon
First Minister,
capture, or indeed our standards around heating and reducing emissions. What makes that job far more difficult, Presiding Officer, is that the opposition oppose every single measure we bring to this chamber to tackle the climate crisis.
Question number 4, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what analysis of passenger behaviour and numbers has been carried out since the inception of the removal of peak rail fares pilot.
First Minister.
The trial is an exciting and unique opportunity to encourage more people to leave their cars at home, choose a safe, reliable and green form of public transport. I can confirm that an interim analysis is due to be published shortly. It examines the impact on rail travel patterns and other modes. The Scottish Government will carefully consider the impact and, of course, the long-term sustainability of any further measures before we confirm what our next steps are.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the First Minister for that answer. The removal of peak fares has been greatly welcomed by my Aberdeen Central constituents and by tens of thousands of other people across Scotland, and in my opinion has been beneficial to many during these tough times caused by the cost of living crisis. Can the First Minister give an indication on whether the removal of peak fares will become permanent?
First Minister.
I'm really pleased to hear about the positive impact that this particular policy is having on Mr Stewart's constituents, and I've heard similar stories from my own constituents and constituents of other MSPs right across the country, particularly during this cost of living crisis. But the purpose of the ScotRail peak fares is twofold: to find out whether such measures do help to move people from car to rail use, but also to help passengers facing the cost of living crisis. So we know that price and simplicity are crucial for people when it comes to choosing how to travel. So the pilot, we know, as has already been said, operate until the end of June. As such, it would be, of course, inappropriate to confirm whether, of course, the abolition of peak fares will become permanent ahead of a final evaluation. So it will be important to review the data as the entire purpose, of course, of the pilot, to see whether or not we're seeing that modal shift and to examine the data around how much this is helping people during a cost of living crisis. But of course, when that evaluation has been appropriately analysed, we will of course inform Parliament of the next stages and steps in relation to this particular policy.
Alec Crowley.
Presiding Officer, there's no doubt that if we are to get any place near reaching our net zero targets, then we have to do much better when it comes to reducing emissions in transport. So will the First Minister commit to come back to this chamber in enough time so that we will be able to hopefully make this pilot permanent, because what in effect is the case is that people are being priced off public transport. And if we want to tackle that and we want to get more people to use public transport, then it is exactly this type of step, which I welcome, that we need to now make permanent.
First Minister.
I can say to Alex Rowley that, of course, we will evaluate the data and we will, of course, bring forward an analysis of that data. It's important that we don't preempt that data. We need to see whether the data actually has shown us, has demonstrated that modal shift that Alex Rowley rightly talks about. So let's not preempt that data. Let's examine that data, let's analyse the evidence, and then let's let other MSPs do the same with the analysis of that data. I agree with the thrust of his question, though, that it is important to invest in our public transport. Hence why I'm very pleased that this government invested in Leavenworth Railway, something that, of course, Alex Rowley, I'm sure, would welcome. It's why we have an extremely generous concessionary travel scheme. I would say, though gently to Alex Rowley, that is why I make the point. It is extremely frustrating for this government when we do bring forward various policies to encourage that modal shift to help to reduce our carbon emissions. They are often opposed by the opposition. We brought forward the workplace parking levy, for example. It was called by his colleague, who is sitting just a couple of rows behind him, Colin Smith. He described it as highway robbery. He called it a car park tax. So it's really unfortunate, Presiding Officer, that when we bring forward these measures, opposition parties oppose it simply for the sake of opposing it.
Question number 5, Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister whether the Scottish Government will engage with NHS Scotland on ending the prescription of puberty-suppressing hormones to children following the recent announcement by NHS England.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, we are aware of the new clinical policy issued by NHS England last week on the routine prescription of puberty-suppressing hormones for children and young people as a treatment option for gender dysphoria. The details of this are being closely considered by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and its relevant clinical team, obviously as the provider of young people's gender services at Sandyford. Any decision on how such healthcare is delivered in Scotland will rightly be made by health boards, but most importantly, the clinicians involved. It should be noted NHS England's announcement follows our interim policy position last year, recommending puberty blockers are only accessed via a research programme it is establishing. The Scottish Government and NHS Scotland remain observers to this particular study, and we're considering what further engagement may be appropriate.
Megan Gallagher.
I asked the First Minister about the prescription of puberty blockers to children in May last year. The First Minister said, and I quote, "I support such decisions being made by clinicians, by the people who have clinical knowledge. We should trust those who have clinical expertise, as opposed to standing here in the chamber making judgments about what is best for young people who need gender identity services. But the truth of the matter is, we don't know if puberty blockers have long-term, life-changing consequences on young people who take them. That's why NHS England are conducting a review. Therefore, will the First Minister publish all evidence his government has that puberty blockers are safe for children? And if his government doesn't have any evidence, why is he allowing NHS health boards to prescribe them?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, Megan Gallagher read out my response to her last time round. My position hasn't changed one iota, hasn't changed one bit. I still believe it is the point that clinical experts in Scotland should be the ones who determine whether or not puberty blockers are prescribed or not. I think that's a sensible position, as opposed to politicians demanding what clinical treatment should be. It should be for the clinical experts. In terms of the study that is taking place, I did reference in my response to Megan Gallagher's very first question that we are engaging with the study that's taking place. The Scottish Government and NHS Scotland are well engaged with NHS England on its planned study into the use of puberty blockers in young people's gender identity healthcare. We are observers to that study, and that remains a work in progress. We are considering what future engagement in that research may well be possible. So I just go back to the point that I've made already to Megan Gallagher. Of course, it is for clinicians to make these judgments. I think it is right that we trust our clinicians and their expert decision making. And in terms of the studies that are taking place in England, I'm more than happy to confirm that we are observers. We are keeping close to NHS England, and we'll continue to do so as that study develops.
Question number 6, Pauline McNeill.
To ask the First Minister what resources the Scottish Government will be providing to Police Scotland for the investigation of complaints made under the Hate Crime and Public Order Act 2021.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, we have worked with justice partners, including, of course, Police Scotland, to ensure the Act is effectively implemented when it commences next month. The Scottish Police Authority's budget for 24-25 delivers record police funding of £1.55 billion. It's an increase of £92.7 million when compared to the current financial year. It is for the SPA and the Chief Constable to allocate this budget according to their priorities and their needs, and that should absolutely include the investigation of complaints that are made under the Hate Crime Act. I'm aware that some commentary in the Act, as I've already said, is not really reflective or indeed accurate of the measures in the Act, which was passed by a majority of this Parliament. The Act does not stop freedom of expression, however, it does make unlawful the intention of stirring up hatred against a person or community for particular characteristics, as the law already does for race.
Pauline McNeill.
The First Minister has reiterated several times today that the Hate Crime Act, which comes into force on the 1st of April, must deliver what Parliament intended, that people must not be criminalised for expressing their opinions, and I agree. Some organisations are still concerned this legislation will be used maliciously to silence legitimate opinion, and it would be helpful, First Minister, if the Scottish Government would engage with those groups. So does the First Minister agree that how the Act is interpreted by the police is key and how they are trained is key, and that resources are crucially important? So does the First Minister understand my concerns that the police are not properly resourced, but crucially, properly and adequately trained to implement the Act as it was intended? And we agree on this, that it could risk criminalising innocent people and further stretching police resources. Make this Act work and make sure that there is full resources to ensure that what this Parliament intended is delivered.
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, can I say that I know Pauline McNeill takes the issue of tackling hatred very, very seriously. It's something she and I have worked on over the years in many different guises. Let me try to give some assurance to Pauline McNeill and those she is raising concerns on behalf of. First of all, I make the point that I made already to Douglas Ross, that there are multiple freedom of expression safeguards within the law. There is explicitly a freedom of expression safeguard within the legislation. There is, of course, the reasonable person defence. But there is also, of course, the fact that the legislation has to apply with the European Convention of Human Rights, and Article 10 being particularly important. So there's a triple lock of safeguards that are already there. In terms of how the police then enforce the Act, let me again try to give Pauline McNeill some assurances. Police officers since 1986, virtually my whole life, have been, I think, effectively policing and enforcing the law and stirring up of hatred for crimes in relation to race. Now, the threshold for the new offences is higher than, of course, the racial stirring up offence. But if they've been doing so since 1986, with virtually zero controversy, I've got every confidence that they're able to do so for the new offences that are being brought into law in just a matter of weeks' time. In terms of resourcing and training, I'll just reiterate the points I've already made. We are providing record funding for Police Scotland in relation to the next year's budget, and in training, again refer to the points that have already been made by Police Scotland in the public domain, and I have every confidence in their ability to train officers for this Act when it comes into force. And I'm very pleased this Act will be coming into force, because I believe it will give people the necessary protections at a time when we're seeing hate crime far too pervasive in our society, far too prominent in our society, and being peddled by some with impunity in our society.
Thank you, First Minister. Ivan McKee.
The First Minister will be aware that the Police Scotland hate crime website explicitly stereotypes young working class men from constituencies like mine and his as most likely to commit a hate crime. Does he agree with me that publicly demonising this disadvantaged group, already heavily impacted by negative interactions with the criminal justice system and disproportionately damaged by addiction and other challenges, will neither assist them nor aid efforts by many community groups and others in my constituency who work to create opportunities for them?
First Minister.
Well, sure, Presiding Officer, why the Conservatives were shouting down Mr McKee when he was asking his question, I think it's a legitimate point that when it comes to any marketing, any awareness campaigns that are done, it's exceptionally important that there's no stigmatisation of any communities whatsoever. Let's just stick to the evidence and the facts in relation to those who are victims, and indeed anybody that is a perpetrator of hate crime. But let's do that in a way that doesn't stigmatise one or other community, and certainly doesn't pit communities against each other. The entire point of the hate crime Act, and indeed I think all of our endeavours, or most of our endeavours in this chamber around tackling hate crime, are around so that we can have a more cohesive society as opposed to one that pits one community against another. So I do agree with Ivan McKee that we should focus on tackling stigmatisation, stigma wherever it exists in our society. He's also right to highlight that many organisations and agencies that are providing opportunities to our young people,
First Minister.
Whether it's the work of Skills Development Scotland, national training programmes and apprenticeship programmes, and many others that are supporting our young people during these challenging times.
First Minister. In the time we have available for constituency and general supplementaries, I call Liam Kerr.
Very grateful, Presiding Officer. Devastating figures this week revealed people can be waiting up to 2 years for audiology assessments at NHS Grampian. The Chief Executive, Adam Caldwell's, laid the blame for that squarely at the door of this government, which underfunds the service and fails to properly workforce plan. How precisely does this government intend to drive these waiting times down, and when will the people of the North East see results?
First Minister.
Presiding Officer, first and foremost, when it comes to long waits, I reiterate what I've already said here, that anybody is waiting far too long, of course, that is not acceptable, and we are working hard to recover our NHS services. In terms of Grampian itself, in 24-25, NHS frontline boards will receive, of course, increased investment of almost 550 million, a real terms increase of almost 3%. NHS Grampian seeing £46.6 million increase in its investment, and that is the decisions that this government is proud to take, in very stark contrast to the Conservatives in England. We are investing in our NHS at a time when they're choosing tax cuts for the wealthy over investment in public services, Presiding Officer.
And Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer, babies across the UK face delay in treatment for the debilitating genetic condition spinal muscular atrophy because no newborn screening programme exists. I recently met 2 impacted families who want to know why the majority of European countries screen for SMA, yet we don't. Something I've been campaigning for some time. It makes a real difference to the lives of newborn babies. Does the First Minister agree with me, given it now appears likely there will be a UK screening pilot for SMA, that Scotland should be included? And will the First Minister meet with me to discuss work undertaken in Scotland to prepare for such a pilot, including, I think he will welcome, identifying potential partnership funds to deliver it?
First Minister.
I do, of course, recognise the urgency families in Scotland feel around this issue. For those affected by spinal muscular atrophy, it can be absolutely devastating. I share the desire for any action that would prevent that. The UK National Screening Committee is very much in the best place to evaluate all the evidence, and I do welcome the in-service evaluation that NHS England is carrying out. I hope that that will bring us closer to a decision. Discussions are ongoing about the potential for a Scottish-specific study or for Scotland to participate in the ISE and the in-service evaluation. However, there are a number of factors that must be worked through before a final decision can be reached. And of course, I'm always happy, as is the Health Secretary, to meet with Bob Doris on this very important issue.
That concludes First Minister's questions. The next item of business is a member's business debate in the name of Douglas Ross, and there will now be a short suspension to allow those leaving the chamber and public gallery to do so.
Okay, could I encourage members leaving the chamber to do so as quickly and quietly as possible? Could I also encourage members in the public gallery who are leaving, again, to do so quickly and as quietly as possible as we move on to the next item of business, which is a members' business debate on motion 12449 in the name of Douglas Ross on Sarwar surgeries, Burghead and Hopeman. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I'd invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons and invite Mr Ross to open the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I thank all members who supported my motion and will contribute today. Can I also express my thanks and appreciation to the members of the Sarwar Surgeries group who have been determined to get the very best for their villages and reinstate the GP practices in Hopeman and Burghead. Presiding Officer, today 5 members of the Sarwar Surgeries group have travelled from the Murray Coast here to Holyrood. So I want to welcome Dennis Slater, Rona Grant, Ness Tugdell, Hazel Grant and Liz McNoctor here to the Scottish Parliament to have their voices heard. And can we also welcome Abby Duncan from the Northern Scot newspaper, who's here to record not just this debate, but the meetings I know that she's had, the group have had with the Scottish Labour Party, SNP, and will be meeting with members of the Scottish Conservatives afterwards. This group, along with their fellow campaigners and residents, have been strong, passionate and determined voices calling for healthcare facilities to return to their villages. But it's important to note, while based in Hopeman and Burghead, these surgeries serve the communities of Duffus, Cummingston, Roseisle and the outlying rural areas as well. So today, the campaigners are not just representing Hopeman and Burghead and these other villages, but 1,500 people who signed the petition to reinstate these vital GP practices. Their voice is now being heard in the Scottish Parliament, but it has taken us too long to get to this stage, and it is only because of their determined efforts that we see this campaign continuing. So I hope at the end of today's debate we do get more responses from the Scottish Government, and I really welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary himself will be responding to this debate and has agreed to meet with the group afterwards as well. We also need to get more action from NHS Grampian and Health and Social Care Murray as well. I briefly want to give an overview of how we got to this stage. Back in June 2017, the Hopeman practice closed due to an IT fault. Then, on the 14th of March 2020, both practices closed because we were told they were incompatible with COVID regulations. But we were told, we were promised, that they would be temporary closures of Burghead and Hopeman. March 2020, now here we are, March 2024, those surgeries never opened their doors again. Indeed, the Hopeman premises has now been sold, and the Burghead one, the lease has been handed back. And Burghead in particular, we have a local family so determined to continue with the presence in the village there that they offered to work with the Health Board, with Health and Social Care Murray, to offer that property, to put in the improvements needed, but that was rejected. That offer still stands today. They have offered the first year free of rent if the Health Board would go back to Burghead. But since then, that temporary closure has continued. And we know there has been so much work done by the Sarwar Surgeries group and campaigners throughout that time. But where the frustrations really come alive is the lack of any tangible, significant and realistic engagement with the Health Board and Health and Social Care Murray. It's almost shocking to have to remind the Chamber that a consultation was done. But it was a sham. It was a consultation in name only, a tick-box exercise. How else can you describe the outcome when 85% of residents who responded to that were against the closures, but these surgeries are still shut? When 100% of the people at the public engagement events said they wanted the facilities to remain open in Hopeman and Burghead and they remain closed, then it was nothing more than a tick-box exercise at a cost of over £11,000. It's so frustrating that the voices so articulately making the case for these surgeries to be retained have been ignored in this way. And I think it's also important, and the campaigners have been very clear, that while this is a local issue in Murray, and my motion refers to the Highlands and Islands, I know there are members across the country who are feeling the same impact with local services in their own area. And this is an issue that deserves to be addressed here in Parliament, because the closures of local GP surgeries have an impact on national policies set by the Scottish Government. And I will give way to a couple of members in a moment, and I want to come on to how the closure of these local facilities hampers what the Scottish Government are trying to do with their national policies. But I'll give way to Richard Lockhead.
Richard Lockhead.
Can I thank Douglas Ross for giving way and congratulate him on securing this important debate, and also join in paying tribute to Save Our Surgeries campaign, who are here today for promoting the interests of their communities. I concur with the member's concerns as expressed in his opening remarks. And does he agree with me that it's really important, given that new GPs will be coming into the workforce in the near future, that NHS Education Scotland work closely with NHS Grampian to ensure that these new GPs are channelled towards the areas most in need, like Birkhead, Hopeman and the rest of Moray?
Douglas Ross, I can give you the time back.
Richard Lockhead and I and other members here and those in the public gallery are very blessed to live in Moray. And I know if we can attract these new GPs to Moray, they will want to stay there. They will want to work in our community. They will want to work with the residents of Hopeman and Birkhead. So I fully endorse everything Richard Lockhead has said. And I have to say, this has been a truly cross-party issue. There has been no party politics played here. I think the fact that the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, the SNP Health Secretary, myself and others have all met with the campaigners, Richard Lockhead as well. They have worked right across the political spectrum, because their case is far more important than party politics, and I think that's credit to the Save Our Surgeries campaigners. I'll give way to Craig Hoy.
Craig Hoy.
Mr Ross for giving way. Is he aware that in my own region, NHS Borders is facing the prospect of cutting frontline budgets by 10%, and NHS Lothian faces a £120 million black hole? As a result, Dr Joe Smale, a GP at Trinent Medical Practice, has written to me warning that NHS Lothian is now set to increase facilities management charges on the practice by 600%. She says that in order to cover this new cost on the practice, they will potentially have to lose around 3,200 GP appointments per year. And she goes on to warn that we would no longer be able to provide primary care services for our patients, and would have no other option but to hand back our contract. Does the member share my concerns that the chronic underfunding of GP services, particularly in rural and remote areas, is seriously undermining the delivery of patient care?
Douglas Ross.
I do agree with that. We have seen that throughout the country, and it is a worrying trend that seems to be continuing. I spoke before the interventions about how the impact of local closures do lead to a problem with implementing national policies. So we look at multidisciplinary working. That can't happen when you close local facilities. The Scottish Government are supposed to be against the centralisation of service provisions, yet people in Hopeman and Birkhead are now supposed to go to Lossiemouth. I'll come on to that very briefly in a moment. And 20-minute neighbourhoods, that's something that the Scottish Government have promoted. That is not possible when you're closing surgeries like Birkhead and Hopeman. I want to briefly finish, Presiding Officer, with an excellent policy briefing I received from Age Scotland ahead of this debate, and I'm grateful to them for it. I asked for more specific Moray figures. They tell us that 44% of over 50s in Moray had to wait a week or more to access GP appointments. And they go on to say, although Lossiemouth is around a 15-minute drive each way, many older people are unable to drive or do not have access to a car from Hopeman or Birkhead to Lossiemouth. 21% of over 65s did not own or access a car in Moray. They go on to say the journey by bus from Hopeman and Birkhead to Lossiemouth is not direct. For some, it could take 4 hours, round trip, 4 hours for potentially just a 10-minute appointment. This is the impact it is having on local people. And they also said that 44% of over 50s in Moray who had to wait a week or more to access GP appointments is almost double the national average of 23%. That is why this is having such a big impact. And finally, they say that this whole closure programme goes against Murray's own Health and Social Care Strategic Delivery Plan 2023 to 2025, which has a key focus on the progress of integration agenda by increasing access to community-based health and social care services. Murray's Health and Social Care Joint Commissioning Strategy for Older People states that older people will be able to live more independently as long as possible in their own homes. They can't do that if we are closing down local GP surgeries. I'm grateful for your indulgence, Presiding Officer, for allowing me a few more minutes. Can I once again reiterate my heartfelt thanks to the Save Our Surgeries campaigners who have tirelessly put up and put forward the case for the reopening of these facilities or some kind of healthcare facility in the two villages. They have worked their socks off. We are proud of them throughout Murray for everything they have done. They are now in their Parliament here at Holyrood to hopefully get reassurance that their message is being heard at the highest possible level. But it can't just be heard, it must be acted upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ross. We now move to the open debate. I call first Emma Harper to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Up to 4 minutes, Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to start by thanking all of Scotland's GPs for the invaluable work that they do to support people across Scotland with their health and well-being needs. I worked as a nurse for over 30 years and absolutely know how valuable and essential and important our GPs and the multidisciplinary team are who work in the GP practices. And I am really sorry, Presiding Officer, that I won't be able to stay for the whole debate, and I thank the PO for agreeing for me to leave, as I have a long-standing meeting that I had already arranged. I do also want to pay tribute to Douglas Ross, as he has done as well, to our Save Our Surgeries group, and I welcome that some of the members are here in the gallery. It is clear that Save Our Surgeries, the group, like many community action groups, such as Galloway Community Hospital Action Group in my own South Scotland region, they are crucial in advocating for service improvements, for enhancements and advances for any healthcare delivery, and that it should be delivered at a local level. The stats... No, I will not take an intervention, actually, because we've only got 4 minutes, and I'm really sorry I have to shoot out here to meet the George Washington University students. So, the stats that have been described by Douglas Ross really highlight the challenges of older people in rural area with travel, with getting to different areas, and he described Lossiemouth actually as a 4-hour bus journey would be quite a challenge, I think, for older people. And turning to the motion from Douglas Ross and from looking into this case as well, I agree that Burghead and Hopeman surgeries closure did have an impact on the local communities. The surgeries have been a feature of Burghead and Hopeman for many years, and that was recognised by the Local Integration Joint Board, which did carry out a consultation in 2022 to ensure the voices of the community were heard. However, from my own casework, I am all too aware of how disappointing some of the approaches to IGB consultations can be, so that, as this motion indicates, I can understand the concerns of the residents. I would urge the IGB and the NHS Grampian to ensure that the healthcare needs and indeed the voices of the people in smaller rural communities are being met appropriately. And this can only be achieved through engaging with local campaigners and residents and members of the communities, and I would expect that all partners work to this end. Presiding Officer, unfortunately, challenges with the delivery of GP and associated services, they aren't confined to the Highlands. And across Dumfries and Galloway, and I know that Mr Carson is sitting in chamber because it is important for us as well in Dumfries and Galloway. It's also a very large rural region, and we're hearing daily from the NHS Board how they continue to struggle to recruit GPs to staff the region's rural surgeries. And according to the ISD, the Information Service Division, for which data is available, 100% of GP practices in D&G are reliant upon locum GPs due to recruitment challenges. However, some welcome recent improvements have been made, and I am going to mention ScotGem, the Scottish Graduate Entry to Medicine programme. ScotGem offers people who are graduates in subjects such as pharmacy, nursing and science the opportunity to obtain a medical degree in a 4-year graduate programme. And ScotGem does have a particular focus on preparing doctors to work in rural areas of Scotland. And the course launched in 2018, and after the student's initial year of university, NHS D&G welcomed its first intake in 2019. The ScotGem programme is working well. So far, the region in D&G supported 54 graduates, so that is pretty good news. But what we want to see is I guess, the continuation of ScotGem. So I'd ask that the Cabinet Secretary responds to tell us a little bit about the success and the commitment to continue with ScotGem so that recruitment can be made for our rural areas. I will stop there. I acknowledge the progress that has been made, and again, apologies, Presiding Officer, that I'm unable to stay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I now call Rhoda Grant to be followed by Edward Mountain. Around 4 minutes. Ms Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I also want to thank Douglas Ross for bringing this debate to the Chamber, and also join with him and the other speakers to commend the work of Save Our Surgeries campaign. Their fight to save their GP services within their community has been fantastic. They refuse to take no for an answer. I also want to thank Age Scotland for their briefing on this debate as well. As Douglas Ross said, these surgeries were closed, have never reopened, and now they will remain closed permanently. The branches not only cover Burghead or Hopeman, indeed they encompass a population of around 7,000 people. And despite having no response from either the Joint Board or the practice, or indeed NHS Grampian, the campaign group remain really pragmatic, because they believe that there is a better local solution to be found. They've suggested nurse-led services, nurses available locally in the community for doing things like taking bloods, physical checks, and enabling older people who aren't good with new technology to have video consultations with the practice at Lossiemouth. But that has fallen on deaf ears, and they are being forced to travel from Burghead and Hopeman to Lossiemouth. Those are short journeys in miles, but there is no direct bus service, so patients need to travel by bus via Elgin, and that can take, as we've heard, 4 hours. But not only that, that's a £9 bus fare. And if you can't get a bus, you take a taxi, and that's £60. And that's no way for an NHS free at the point of need if people have to pay those huge amounts of money just simply to see their doctor. There is a dial bus service as well, and it was suggested as an alternative, but it requires to be booked the day before. So if you are unwell, you need an emergency appointment, it's absolutely unsuitable, and it doesn't cover the whole of the surgery time. So it may be that you could get the dial bus service to the surgery, but you couldn't get back home again. Add to this that Age Scotland tell us that 82% of older people prefer face-to-face appointments with their GP. Therefore, these changes are more likely to impact on the very vulnerable. Age Scotland also tell us that 26% of those with a disability and 47% of those with long-standing health conditions in Murray don't have access to a car, so they're absolutely dependent on public transport. As we've heard as well, those villages are expanding and therefore are in more need of GP services. And in anywhere else, this would be seen as a success story, because we're always talking about depopulation in rural areas. Where we've got growing populations, we really need to preserve the services to allow people to continue living there. And this whole debate speaks more widely about closures and changes to services in rural areas, centralisation, and it means that people just aren't receiving the same level of services as they live in, if they live in rural areas. There are wider issues, as others alluded to. The 2018 GP contract was supposed to make GP services sustainable going forward. They actually had the opposite impact on rural GPs, and the Scottish Government can see this. It's demonstrated in front of them, and yet they haven't acted in looking at a rural GP contract. These don't appear to be the problems at play here, but we need to find a solution for the people of Murray. So I would ask the Cabinet Secretary, will he make sure that the IJB meets with the campaigners, something that they've been looking to do? And will he also intervene to make sure that these people have access to local GP services in one form or another?
Thank you, Ms Grant. I now call Edward Mountain to be followed by Fergus Ewing. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too would like to thank Douglas Ross for bringing this debate to the Chamber and for the contribution for Rhoda Grant. I wouldn't say she's stolen a lot of my thunder, but she's obviously very well researched on the problems of the closure of Hopeman and Berghead surgeries. And I'd like to welcome the campaigners to the Parliament, their Parliament, to make their voices heard. Let me be entirely clear, every GP closure is a disaster. Every single doctor-GP surgery is a failure. And every GP surgery that hasn't got a succession plan is doomed. And we can't afford to have this. Let's be clear, some of the figures that are in the open in the public domain in the last 10 years, we've seen 89 GP surgeries closed. 1 in 10 surgeries, GP surgeries, are now run by health boards. And there's been a huge increase in the use of locums. In Murray alone, I mean, I know the Aberlour Health Centre, which is my health centre, got to the stage where it had to be taken over by NHS Grampian because there weren't sufficient doctors there and all the patients were leaving. It still hasn't been resolved, but it's a huge concern to communities. And I wonder to myself why this happens. Why do we get ourselves into this situation? And I think a lot of it can be put down to the point that Rhoda Grant made about GP contracts. The 2018 GP contract that was negotiated seems to work fairly well if you're in the Central Belt, maybe Glasgow and Edinburgh, but doesn't work for rural GPs, doesn't work for rural practices. If it did work for rural practices, we would see more GPs in these rural practices. What we know it hasn't done is it hasn't delivered the extra staff that was promised as part of it. We've also seen NHS boards removing vaccinations from local GP surgeries, something that GPs across the Highlands were against. And we've seen them also removing secondary care from GPs, undermining GP practices, which frankly we can't do. I mean, we've just seen, and I'm delighted to say that I'm working with Mr Ewing and Rhoda Grant on the issues faced by Granton Medical Practice, who've had funding removed from the building project that they've been promised and was almost completed. Frankly, that is a disaster for the local community. And I have to say that, you know, in the 5 days that the petition's been open, I've never seen such a flurry of people trying to sign it. And they can't all sign it online, and there's paper applications to join it. But I think there's well over 500 people signed up in the first 5 days. That's how important GP surgeries are. So I trust that we will get a chance to discuss that in time. But we need a review. We need a review of the mechanism of how we run our GP surgeries, and we need a review of the GP contract. The problem is that when the government negotiated the GP contract, there is no review process within that. So it looks like we're going to lurch on and on and on with declining GP numbers and contracts that don't work across rural Scotland. That, to me, is a huge mistake. So my plea today, and I'm delighted to be part of this debate on a wider scale across Scotland, let's review the GP contract. Let's get a new workforce plan out. Let's deliver to the GPs the extra workforce that we promised. Let's stop removing the very sensible additional services that they provide. And then we wouldn't be faced with the disasters that the closure of GP practices like Hopehead and Bergman have caused. Thank you very much, President.
Thank you, Mr Millington. I now call the final speaker in the open debate, Fergus Ewing, around 4 minutes. Mr Ewing.
Yes, may I congratulate Mr Ross for bringing this debate forward and the consensual spirit in which everybody has participated. I used to, with my late wife Margaret, live in Lossiemouth, just along the road from Birkhead and Hopeman, and nearly visited the Birkhead surgery many, many years ago when I was dive-bombed by a seagull who managed to make contact with my ear in the breeding ground just beyond Birkhead, which I'm sure our visitors will be aware of. But seriously, if Margaret had been here, she would have been campaigning alongside people in all other parties, as she did with the Mum campaign and others over her 19 years as the parliamentary representative. Presiding Officer, the motion, and Mr Ross did refer beyond Birkhead and Hopeman to the wider Highlands, and the motion refers to serving local communities. So I hope it's in order for me to refer to the campaign currently being mounted on a cross-party basis by myself, by Ed Mountain, by Rhoda Grant, all of whom are here, to persuade the Cabinet Secretary for Health to overturn the decision to halt the refurbishment of the Granton Health Centre, a project which we understand from our conference call with NHS Highland this morning was substantially completed. 2.4 million, £2 million of the work had been done, and it was cancelled because of £400,000. Now, we've been besieged with letters locally, all making the same point, that people can understand the cancellation of projects that haven't started. Emotive though that is. I mean, many excellent campaigns, the Belfort, for example. But for a project that's nearly completed, it makes no sense, because it will end up costing an awful lot more. And my specific plea, without labouring all this, Presiding Officer, is that the meeting I requested last Friday take place very soon, if possible next week or thereafter. I know it's the recess coming up soon. And the reason for that, Cabinet Secretary, is that Morrison's, the contractors, are still on site. They're champing at the bit to complete the contract. But if we don't sort this out quickly, they will have to remove their 2 porta cabins from the site. They will incur further abortive costs, and the abortive costs which we will intimate to the Cabinet Secretary will mount and exceed the notional capital savings, which is £400,000. I think ways can always be found in government, I know they can, to sort this out. So I wanted to make that plea. And just the other brief point I'd make is to back up really what Mr Mountain says about the GP contract. And it wasn't popular in the Highlands. It was a metropolitan concoction, really. And in particular, recently, Dr Adrian Baker from the Nairn GP practice has been arguing, in fact, for the last 3 years, with successive health secretaries, I may say, to restore the right for GPs who wish to do so to provide various services which the GP contract is taking away from them, including vaccination. And in the case of vaccination, my understanding is that the NH Highlands' own internal report found that moving the service back to GPs would not only secure the greater number of people having vaccinations and protection, particularly against measles, where the centralised provision is resulting in a dangerously low level of cover. So moving it back to GPs would be better for the patient, but it would also save several £1 million. Several £1 million. Now, I'll deal with the Cabinet Secretary. If he grants GPs the right to restore their vaccination services, and thereby, taking up my advice, he saves several £1 million, I'm happy with that, as long as he makes the modest contribution of £400,000 towards the Granton Health Centre. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Ewing. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary to respond to the debate. Cabinet Secretary, around 7 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. First of all, can I thank and congratulate Douglas Ross on bringing this debate today. And like him and everybody else that has spoken, welcome the Save Our Surgeries campaigners to our National Parliament today. Looking forward to meeting with them after this session. Because I recognise, as Douglas Ross and others have, the very doughty campaigning efforts that they have undertaken. The fact that they are here today is a testament to that campaigning effort, in spite of the situation that the branch surgeries are in. Douglas Ross rightly outlined the fact that one facility has closed, one, the lease has expired. But I think that the very helpful suggestions that were made by Douglas Ross and indeed by Rhoda Grant, who spoke of pragmatism, I think is something something I'll return to, but I think is very welcome. I want to respond, if I can, to the points that have been made, and what I think is a very fair debate. The fair point raised by Douglas Ross around the wider area being served by Burghead and Hopeman, and the situation that will be faced not just by the residents of those villages but by the wider area as well. I also recognise the offer that has been suggested through Douglas Ross that is available in terms of a property and doing so free of rent for a period. On the consultation point that Douglas Ross raised, he will be aware that my predecessor, Michael Matheson, obviously instructed a review by Evan Beswick from the Argyll and Bute Health and Social Care Partnership. That report is imminent. I understand that the campaigners may well have seen an early draft of that, which I understand they feel to be fair. I would expect NHS Grampian, the Health and Social Care Partnership, to take due cognizance of what is in that report and to respond accordingly. I also think Richard Lochhead makes a helpful suggestion as well regarding new GPs. There's been some commentary in this debate around where we are with GP numbers. We've got 1,200 new GPs in training, which is a positive move forward. We've seen an increase in GP numbers since we announced the position to wish to see at 800 from 2017 going forward. We're not exactly where we want to be, but we're making progress. I think the suggestion that Richard Lochhead makes and the evangelical advocacy that I would expect of Richard Lochhead and Douglas Ross around the beauty of Murray and the reason that you'd wish to locate yourself there, that we can see what is possible with regards to some of those GPs coming through. Also, very helpful briefing. I'm very grateful for the briefing that came from Age Scotland that was referenced by colleagues across the chamber. As someone who grew up in a rural island community, I more than recognise the challenges of access to public services, healthcare services in particular. I will do in just a second. Indeed, the expectation that there is amongst residents that you have to travel some distance in order to access some of those services, because by their nature you can't safely deliver all of it in those areas. However, I think that their point around, and the point that's been raised today, around the need to make sure, and I concur with it, that we see services being provided as effectively and as locally as possible is absolutely one that I concur with. I'll give way first to Finlay Carson and I'll come back to Finlay Carson. Richard Lochhead.
Very much appreciate you taking my intervention. I think there's a theme coming out here. You know, we heard Emma Harper talk about action groups trying to enhance services, but that's not what it's really about. It's about saving services, whether it's GP services, whether it's maternity services, whether it's Save Our Cottage hospitals. There's a complete crisis in rural Scotland and a lack of delivering services close to home as possible, as you would wish to see. But is this not a time to review the NRAC formula? Because it certainly doesn't seem to be working. I know you've given us assurance that that review would take place, but can you accelerate that process to make sure that rural health boards get the funding that they need?
Comments to the Chair, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, President Officer. I think Finlay Carson makes a fair point about ensuring that we continue to see services being provided as locally as possible. In terms of GP provision, and I pay tribute to general practice managers, GPs themselves, those in the multidisciplinary teams that serve our constituents incredibly well, whether they're in rural and island communities or indeed in urban Scotland. And I point, Finlay Carson, to the Remote and Rural GP Working Group that was chaired by Professor Sir Lewis Ritchie in response to the concerns about rural GPs of the 2018 contract. We're still, one of the recommendations there was around establishing a centre of excellence for remote and rural healthcare, and following the business case development, that National Centre for Remote and Rural Healthcare was launched in October, has been delivered by NES, and the Scottish Government is providing funding of £3 million in 2026. But I take the point. It's something that I'll go away and look at and come back to Finlay Carson. I'll give way to Richard Lochhead.
Richard Lochhead.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way in his constructive response to the debate so far. He may be aware that Glasgow School of Art have a campus in my constituency of Murray, and that hosts the Rural Centre of Excellence for Digital Health and Care Innovation. And at my instigation, they've been discussing with the Murray Health and Social Care Partnership the possibility of a project to look at innovation and the delivery of rural health services using Murray as a pilot, as being prompted by what's happening in Birkhead and Hopeman in that area. I understand they're looking for around £30,000 to take this forward. There may be some question marks over how that's going to be funded. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could look into how that could be funded, because the whole of rural Scotland would benefit from the outcome of that research project.
Cabinet Secretary can give the time back for the
Thank you, President Officer. I thank Richard Lochhead for his intervention and for pointing out the situation that's been faced there. I'm conscious that Jenny Minto has met with them on this. I'm happy to take away, in concert with Ms Minto, Richard Lochhead's ask and see if anything can be done in order to see that continue, because this is obviously an opportunity for us to learn more and to be able to see what can be done in rural communities. And I go back to the briefing from Age Scotland, because I recognise the point made by them in terms of access to public transport, access to a vehicle, and the statistics that Douglas Ross pointed to in terms of car use in that particular part of Murray, and how that increases the challenge when we see facilities such as those in Hopeman and Birkhead close. And that makes it a particular challenge in this part of Murray due to the public transport links. So while Rhoda Grant rightly points to the dial-a-bus option, that is not suitable for same-day appointments. So I think, again, this is why I think Evan Beswick's work is going to be really important, and why I would encourage the Health and Social Care Partnership and NHS Grampian to engage with that, engage with the campaigners around any practical suggestions that there may be for how that can be overcome. If I've got time, President Officer, I'll give way to Douglas Ross.
Douglas Ross.
Grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for allowing the intervention, and I think there will be great comfort taken by campaigners and people in the area with the approach that the Cabinet Secretary has taken to this, and that encouragement would go even further if he will look to use his influence as Cabinet Secretary for Health to accept these are local decisions that will be taken by NHS Grampian and Health and Social Care Murray, but with the Cabinet Secretary stressing the importance of facilities in these villages. That will make a big impact to the campaigners and what they are seeking to do. And they're also not looking for all singing, all dancing GP practices to be reopened. Great though that would be, and I would absolutely support it, there are other opportunities to have some healthcare facilities in either or both of Birkhead and Hopeman that doesn't need to be a full replacement service, that could make a big impact to local people in the villages.
Cabinet Secretary.
I think that's a helpful suggestion, and one that's characteristic of the way that Douglas Ross opened this debate, which was fair and pragmatic. I'm happy to take that consideration away, and I think working with NHS Grampian, the Health and Social Care Partnership, because this is a local decision, and there are practical issues that need to be overcome in terms of who runs these facilities, how it is staffed, if that is something that could be got to. So I can't make any promises to Douglas Ross or indeed to the campaigners. I wouldn't wish to do so, but I think a consideration where there is a suggestion, where there are practical areas of change that can be brought forward to benefit those communities, recognising the demographic and geographical challenges, then I think they should at least be considered, and they should be considered in consort with those local communities. So, in closing, Presiding Officer, I wish to thank everybody who's participated in this debate, to Douglas Ross again for bringing it forward, and in particular to the local campaigners who have ensured that Scotland's National Parliament is considering an issue that is being faced by colleagues across Scotland to differing extremes. It's an issue in terms of branch surgery closures that I have faced within my constituency as well. Their doughty campaigning means that we've had it under consideration today. They were going to have a further conversation shortly. And while I can make no promises about what the future holds, I hope that at least they will feel that their voice has been heard today and going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:15.